There we go. Okay, there we go. Um, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alon Eisenstein. I'm an associate professor of teaching in entrepreneurship at the School of Engineering, and welcome to the Germinator. Today, I'm going to have a conversation with Ken Chau, and I'll introduce him in a second, and why I'm so excited to have a conversation with Ken. Before that, just giving you a bit of a background context for those of you who are joining for the very first time. The Germinator is a place to have conversations in plural, about where ideas come from and how they grow, mostly hidden from the world until they pop out and we actually see them and celebrate them. And the idea came from working with so many entrepreneurs in the space of innovation and entrepreneurship for well over a decade and seeing how many of these stories just repeat themselves and really intrigued by giving space for these stories that are usually not part of the narrative of entrepreneurship and ideas before they become public. I also want to recognize and respectfully appreciate that I'm joining you from my home in the city of Kelowna, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. And part of recognizing that includes recognizing the wealth of knowledge and cultural assets that the Syilx people have cherished and retained over generations and generations, specifically in the context of ideas and where ideas come from in the culture and the story and the wisdom of the Syilx people. Coyote, Sincleep is a common character, a common animated character that tells the story of where ideas come from and how learning happens, usually by doing bad things and then relying on other people to save him and bring him back to life when he dies in mishaps of making bad decisions. But the ideas that come in Sinclair's story are imaginative, they're educative, and very much in line with what I hope will be my conversation with Ken Chau. With that, I do want to introduce Ken. And so Ken is, first and foremost, he's a professor in electrical engineering. He's also the associate director at the School of Engineering. He is a professor, an entrepreneur. He is a builder of people, and he's extremely creative in leadership and innovation. He has a few companies that he has founded that we're going to maybe touch on today. Within academia, he mentored lots and lots of students, colleagues, myself included, and he works on the intersection between engineering, entrepreneurship, human development. And today we're going to talk about his curiosity and what he sees as the joy and authenticity that fuels innovation. And of course, he is the one that I co-teach with, our engineering capstone project, and is a colleague, a mentor, a friend. And I'm super excited to have this conversation with you online. We usually have these conversations in the classroom in front of students or
True.
in our respective offices. But
True.
this is the first time we're doing it in live audience, recorded for
True.
others to be
True.
part of.
And
Yeah.
and and you know what, to be fair, Alon, a lot of our conversations we do sometimes say, "Oh, I wish students could hear what we're talking about," or "I wish colleagues could hear what we're talking about." So, I think we've been practicing for this for actually many years now, and yeah, and by the way, just for everybody to know, I did not receive any notes about what we're talking about. I'm so comfortable talking with Alon about pretty much anything that. I'm sure whatever we touch on today will be insightful. Hopefully, it will be inspiring a little bit, and hopefully it does give kind of everybody in this room new perspectives on things, which I find always so interesting and enlivening. So let's chat away. Let's chat away, Lon.
Okay. So for those of you who don't know you well and don't know the companies that came under your guidance, I definitely remember Happy Pad is an interesting story. VO2 Master is another one, and then there's Mantis XR. Um, maybe, I mean, I think like, the obvious thing for most people is when we say you're a professor in the School of Engineering. I think people can have a mental idea of what is a professor. For those of you who are your students, definitely. Um, but the entrepreneurship piece is very rare for professors to be involved in entrepreneurship. They do exist, we know. We both know a lot of people who do that, but they are the minority. So just kind of shorthand, what are these companies that you were part of creating and are still actually involved in all of them in different ways?
That's right. That's right. Actually, if you don't mind, I'll peel back the story a little bit to describe kind of maybe the mindset that would lead somebody who is already a faculty member to want to do things like start companies with students, because I do agree that it is rare, but I don't think it's crazy if I am able to share the mindset. Growing up, I've always been super, super curious. I wanted to learn everything. I wanted to do everything. And I remember when I first got the admission letter to go into university, I had two possibilities. One was to become a physiotherapist, and for the people who know me well know that I'm really into sports. Seppi, actually, I play volleyball with. And my first love was basketball, and that's what I actually wanted to do. I wanted to be a physiotherapist for the Toronto Raptors. That was my dream, right? So I had a ticket to my dream in one hand, and in the other hand, I had an acceptance letter with a scholarship and all that stuff to an engineering school, right? And I had thought in my mind for sure I'm going to be a physiotherapist. I'm going to realize my dream. And then for some reason in the last moment, and by the way, I think this is one of those sliding doors moments in your life where you can go down two paths. I picked engineering, right? And I think I picked it because I felt like there was more unknown there, right? And by the way, the path that I picked in engineering, I picked engineering physics. So I picked the most kind of, esoteric, kind of heady, theoretical brand of engineering. And I think I picked it because it was simply challenging. It was really challenging. It was interesting. I got to learn about, statistical mechanics and quantum theory. I got to learn about all these things. And again, it had this unknown, I don't know what I'm going to be on the outside of this, on the other side of this, and that unknown entices me, right? Whereas if I went physiotherapy, I would be a physiotherapist, and I probably would have maybe made it all the way to the NBA as one of their sports, their team physiotherapists, but that door closed, and I opened a different door that had no end in sight. I didn't know I would be at the end of this, so I went down this path, and I ended up doing a PhD because I found a topic of research that was really interesting to me. I ended up being attracted into the US. I worked with some Nobel laureate type scientists. That opened up my eyes in totally new ways, and then I ended up being a professor here, right? And um, I did it because I wanted to be with my wife, who had a career here in Canada, and so I made these decisions, based on my values, based on what I wanted out of life, and I ended up as a faculty member in the School of Engineering, right? And for those of us who are in academia, we know that those first few years when you're earning tenure can be really intense, right? You're basically building a new business by yourself with no training, right? Faculty members aren't trained to do HR, yet you're doing HR. You're not trained to be a counselor, but you're doing counseling. A lot of us aren't actually even trained to be teachers. And that's why, Alon, I was attracted to you, that you're a faculty member who is actually trained as a teacher, right? And that's why I learned so much from you and why I enjoy working with you so much. But yeah, so when you start out as a faculty member, you're actually like learning a ton on the job, right? And those first 5 years were intense. I was doing everything I thought I needed to do. I was publishing papers, I was hiring students, I was training them, I was graduate. I did all the things that were expected of me, and The moment you get tenure, most people celebrate. I had a bit of a crisis when I received that tenure letter. It was like, this is what you're going to do for the rest of your life, right? You're going to publish papers, write grants, train students, you teach, blah, blah, blah. It's going to just be this never-ending cycle. And I felt dread. And that was the dread that I felt dread when I received that letter. And I knew I had to, uh, I felt the pull of the unknown again in my life, right? That same unknown that caused me to pick engineering over physiotherapy. I felt it again when I got tenure. And so I, I I had a sabbatical shortly after getting tenure. It's very common. A lot of people go on sabbatical after they receive tenure. And I remember when I went on sabbatical, I was like, I need to do something. I need to do something challenging, different. Uh, I need to put myself in an uncomfortable position. I need something, and so during my sabbatical, um, I I was already at that time working closely with an entrepreneur named Peter O'Brien, and he had found me, and he had this dream of building a mask that could measure oxygen and CO2 concentrations, right? A mask-worn analyzer. That was his dream, and he was already working in my lab on the technology. And when I took a sabbatical, I was like, okay, well, I'll work a bit closer with you. By the way, I still do carry the original prototype of VO2 Master. There's nothing proprietary here, so I can share it. But this was a 3D printed version of the VO2 Master analyzer. Of course, VO2 Master now is a pretty big company, and they're a pretty big success story. Their analyzers are used all over the world. There's celebrities that use them. It's a pretty neat world that company has tapped into. But yeah, so during my sabbatical, I worked closer with uh, the entrepreneur Peter O'Brien, and I started learning so much about commercialization and how hard it is, and how hard it is to raise money, and how hard it is to push an idea all the way into real world use, right? And all the issues you run into. But I also saw like so much potential, and I saw like, man, I work 3, 4 years with an entrepreneur, and we make a company. I could spend that same time working with a PhD student, and we just produce a thesis, right? So I started looking at like, well, like are there better ways that we as faculty members can spend our time? Like I started questioning that, whether training grad students was like the best way to develop talent. I started wondering, like, are there more holistic ways that we can train students? Can we co-build companies with students? Can we use that as a mechanism to train and build people up? And, so all these new questions started popping in my head about how we do things in academia. That after I worked with Peter, and after he took the idea he was able to translate it from the research environment into a company. I was like, you know what? I'm going to try this again because maybe I was just lucky with Peter, and maybe Peter was just a fluke, and he was this one-off person that could pull it off. So I was like, I'm gonna try it 2 more times. I'm gonna try it with an undergrad. I'm gonna try it with a PhD student, right? And so that's when Kalen was in my lab. He was an undergrad student at the time, and I'm sorry if I'm a little bit long-winded here, but uh, people don't ask about my story very often. So if I'm going to tell my story, I want everybody to know. Um, but Kalen was in my lab, and after he had finished a research term with me, I could tell he wasn't really into the research. So him and I, and this was during my sabbatical, we started thinking, well, what's a hard problem that we can try to solve together, right? Instead of thinking that we have the solution already, can we start to think about some challenges out there that might be worthwhile to look at? And the challenge that Kalen was really inspired to tackle was housing affordability, especially for students. And so that really is the start of Happy Pad. And it was Kalen and I in my basement, and we're like, well, how could we actually make housing more affordable for students? And the idea that we settled on and pursued was, could we take these empty bedrooms that a lot of senior homeowners have, and could we connect them with students, beyond just renting a room, but actually, connecting and building relationships through these shared housing arrangements. So that was the idea that Kayla and I kind of hatched during my sabbatical, and the journey of Happy Pet has been interesting because it's moved from this really small scale prototype, right? And it's been kind of slowly growing layers and growing in impact. And the conversations, at first they were just in Kelowna, and then they became across BC, and then Alberta, and then across the country. And so that's been one example. And the other example was with my PhD student who was doing some computer visualization work. And I was enthralled with this new model of training students. So I told my PhD student, his name was Vincent. I was like, Vincent, I want you to spend half your time in the Accelerate Okanagan Innovation Center. I don't want to see you in my lab half the time, right? And so Vincent, and I was like, and by the way, don't just focus on research, focus on like, think about who might want to be your customer, right? And so I challenge Vincent, don't just think about knowledge creation, think about who could consume that knowledge at the same time. And so Vincent, during his PhD, developed a service that he was offering. It was a 3D visualization service that he was offering to clients during his PhD. And when he was in the Accelerate Okanagan one day, an entrepreneur walked by, saw what he was doing on his laptop, and was like, "What are you doing? That looks so cool." And that entrepreneur ended up acquiring the IP, intellectual property of Vincent's work, and turning it into the company Mantis XR, which provides 3D immersive visualization powered by Vincent's approaches and techniques. But he sells these experiences to sports franchises, right? So, and he's a lovely person. I think that's one thing that's really been inspiring about the path that I've taken that has led to companies being hatched from my work here at UBC, is that the people that I've met along the way have been truly fascinating, like truly fascinating, and have really enriched my understanding of what it means to have impact, and what it means to, like, be really, really passionate about something, right? And so that's a long story. I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry it's been a little bit, but I did have to wind it back so everybody had context.
Yeah.
I didn't. There was no master plan that I was going to build three companies or whatever. It was all organic. It was all based on curiosity. It's that's how I work, right? And so that's how they came about, and that's roughly what they do.
So first of all, thank you. And I think I've heard these stories several times, and I never get tired of hearing you tell them. And I can only imagine people are enjoying it as well if they've never heard these stories before. I do want to make a few observations as I listen to not just what you're telling, but how you're telling it. And then maybe I'll kind of open up to people if they have any questions they wanna ask you at this point. I found it really interesting that you're kind of reflecting on the fact that when you started with VO2 Master, you were following, you were a follower, and you were paying
Yes.
attention, but then you very deliberately turn yourself into a leader to let other people follow your lead, and made that transition and consciously. And I found that, really interesting. Or maybe even before that, I guess the kind of Kalen story is kind of in between, because you're kind of transitioning from a follower to a leader, because you're saying, well, I don't know what we're doing, but let's figure it out together. But you're kind of essentially leading Kalen through a joint discovery to go from a follower to a leader. And then the other thing I found really interesting is, especially the contrast between Vincent and Kalen. In Kaylin's story, you're really starting from what problem do we want to solve? And it has nothing to do with the tech. The tech is an afterthought in many ways. And it was really about say, well, we want to solve this really hard problem. And honestly, I don't think you even said it out loud what HappyPad is. You just said, this is the problem we're solving, and we're solving it in this way, which is again, it's not about getting students in apartments, it's about building connections between, seniors with empty rooms and students needing a place. So very value oriented and problem solving as opposed to describing the tech and the solution,
Yeah.
which so many entrepreneurs we see all the time. They say, "What are you doing?" Well, I have this app. I don't care. That's not the point. The point is that you're solving a problem. Tell me about the problem. So I find it really, really, really nice to hear how you kind of relate to that intuitively. Just start with this is the problem we want to solve. And then in Vincent's case, it did come from, well, I can do this tech stuff, but you're very thoughtful in saying, well, do this tech stuff, but don't do it just here. Do it in the world outside of academia. So you can get a feel for what people can do with it because in it for itself is limited in its ability and again kind of being on the two end between the technology push versus market pull. And I think again we have all these discussions which is not which is better, but what are the differences between them, and there's very very big differences between market pull and technology push, and they have place for both of them in the world. We need to be strategic in understanding which is it we have in our hands right at the moment. So that just a few things that I was hearing in your stories, and you can bet I'm going to use these examples in entrepreneurship when I teach in January. So thank you for
Oh,
shining more light on that.
always, Alon, always. And I'm just going to pick up on a few threads that you left there. First of all, I've actually never thought of my journey as, going from, and thank you for that, because I've never heard that before. I never reflected on me kind of, following in the entrepreneur's mold and then co-learning in the entrepreneur's mold and then leading. I never thought about it like that, to be honest. I think that I'm constantly learning. I don't view myself necessarily as a leader in this space. I don't market myself as a leader in this space. I do think I have probably more experience than most in this space, but I still think there's so much to learn. So hearing yourself be a leader is sometimes a little weird. So, but thank you for that. Second of all, you touched on kind of the very different styles that I took with, let's say, Kalen versus Vincent, and this kind of maybe is something that I'm important that I share with this group is that, sometimes our knowledge and our specialization can hurt us, right? Or it can narrow the scope that we through which we look at the world, right? And I think it's really telling that when I worked with an undergrad who was still in many ways a blank sheet of paper, how I approached the entrepreneurial journey is let's just open ourselves to any problem and let's try to find a problem that we know for sure matters, right? And then let's work backwards. And maybe you could view it as, you said market and technology risk. There's always both, right? Especially when you're trying to commercialize from the university, and you're managing both, right? And you could maybe argue that when you start with finding a good problem first, you are lowering the market risk significantly, right? By doing that work ahead of time. The tech risk may still be high because the solutions that you choose to attack that problem may involve tech that you either don't have or you don't have fully developed, right? And that so
They're too expensive.
or it's too expensive, right? You won't be able to raise enough money in our environment to be able to create that tech. Creating technology is super expensive, right? And so you might have to like use tech that's at a higher readiness level, right? But then you're gonna have competitors, right? Because other people have thought of it too, right? If it's not too much of a barrier. So So you have to be a little bit strategic and manage both risks. Whereas when you jump over to the story, the example of Vincent, right? This is somebody who is already a PhD level expert on a niche technical capability. And the challenge there, the tech risk was not necessarily that high, right? We already have a world-class expert on computer visualization. We're able to do cool things. But the risk there was the market risk, right? Because we didn't know really what problems his technology or his capability were adept at solving, uniquely adept at solving, right? And so we kind of had to go fishing. And that was really me telling him, you know, build your network, talk with people about what you're doing, expose it as much as possible. And chances are, statistically, if you talk to enough people, there will be somebody that will be like, that could be really useful here, right? And that's exactly kind of what happened was that we found somebody. His name is Khalil. Great entrepreneur. Really, also good human. And that's one thing I found too is that when you work with people that just really want to create value and stuff, they more often than not for people that are so like broad-minded and concerned of the whole, more often than not, they're awesome people, right? And so with Vincent, when we were able to find that entrepreneur and he helped us see the why, he helped us see the problem, that kind of then lowered the market risk,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And he's a masterclass storyteller. I should probably bring him to the Germinator, right? I
You
think
totally should.
uh, I had him
He's
as a
not.
guest in a class, but I don't think I had him on a Germinator. So that gave me the idea that I should probably bring him back. Um, maybe take a pause and see if anybody has any questions to for Ken. I think we spent 25 minutes talking about your life story in detail.
I do have a question though. First of all, thanks so much for sharing this story. I really love this, and you're always a great role model in showing me, and I'm pretty sure other colleagues, that there are different dimensions of life, both in academia, outside, and uh, how important it is to keep being good in all dimensions and not just picking one or few. My question about like what I see, or at least the places that I have studied in academia or in engineering, I usually don't see many profs that are also an entrepreneur or working and thinking about commercialization as well as research. And sometimes that we do see, I feel like that's a one direction path from what I do in my lab, and then how can I commercialize it and spin off and then have a company. So what I wanted to ask was about the other direction, like learning about commercialization and also learning about entrepreneurship. How did that change your vision about your research lab, or change the direction that you took?
Yeah. First of all, thank you for that question. There's also, I think, some very kind words as well in that question. So thank you, Seppi. Um, yeah, so I think there's several parts of that, right? First of all, I think your question is, maybe what I want to touch on is the rarity. Why is it that you don't see a lot of uh, entrepreneurial ventures from faculty? I think it's actually quite a natural outcome of the way most people progress through academia. Like when you, first of all, most professors are the straight A students, right? Like first of all, okay, so they're the folks that are used to getting things right, being rewarded for it. So there's already a type of personality that is attracted to academia. Um, there is then kind of years of debt and not high earning, right? And then you become a professor, you know, late 30s, 40s, right? And then you want to start a life. And So I think if you follow the psychological profile of a typical professor, it's, I think it would lean towards risk averse personality style. So I'm not actually surprised that most faculty don't choose to take risks, right? I'll give you an example of like like a real tough decision I made and a real risk that I took. Maybe it's kind of funny, but when at one point one of the entrepreneurs I was working with, they needed like an investment, not to invest in the future, to make payroll. Okay, that's called a cash call. That's different, right? But they needed an investment, and I remember I had two small kids at the time, and the ask was something like 20,000 or something, right? And I wrote the check right away. I did it. I was like, "Yep, let's do it." You know, so I, I have a high risk tolerance, right? And I think that that let me kind of like be remain curious about this path. Um, Even though maybe common sense or it wouldn't really make sense. Like, why would you do it, right? But there's that curiosity that drove me. But yeah, when you think about how most people progress through academia, it's really not conducive to risk taking, right? And then when you think about the tenure process and how you're evaluated and peer review, right? And when you kind of build uh, all those structures into one's career, you tend to orient towards outcomes that the system will be able to recognize and measure, right? And so you have the tendency that a lot of professors will focus on like measurable outcomes like publication, right? And that's measurable, and it's great. And it's important for the knowledge economy to have papers and patents and to produce those outcomes. But then when you look at like something like a company, right? Um, that's a really tough quantity to measure in academia. We don't have the systems to measure, well, how many employees does your company have? Like how much revenue, how many jobs did it create? Like we don't speak that language, right? And so there's a risk that is involved when you start to orient your activities towards those less tangible, but maybe more long-term outcomes, right? And not everybody is comfortable with that risk, right? And so for me, even navigating between being a research faculty member at UBC with being an entrepreneur, um, I sometimes feel really uneasy, and I could feel like a black sheep, right? And I could feel like I don't belong, and like all these are natural feelings that you would have if you were going down a path that was not as well trodden, right? So just to reflect a little bit on your comment about how it's not very common, but now maybe to present the other side of the story, which is, what have I learned by going down this path, and then how does it inform what I do now, right? Because I still do run a research program, and I still do train PhD students, and I still work with postdocs. But by going down the path of commercialization and building a company and co-building a company, like being on the front lines with the entrepreneur and feeling the stresses and the pressures, uh, what I realized, what I've learned in this journey is that the process of commercialization, the process of building companies is really about creating value for others, right? Like fundamentally, that's what it's about. Like you have got to create value for others. And so when I now, you know, now that I have that lens, that mindset, we have to always create value for others. I take it into my teaching, into my research. I take it into my leadership work, right? So when I do anything, oh, when I'm tackling a PhD proposal with students, we are thinking about now from day one, who's going to benefit? Why is this worth doing, right? When I'm leading leadership initiatives, I am thinking about the outcomes, right? And how they trickle down all the way to the students and the taxpayers, right? I constantly hold myself accountable as a faculty member. When I call a meeting, I calculate how many professors I want in that meeting, and I'm like, wow, that meeting costs, that's $20,000 meeting, right? And I'm like, do taxpayers would is this justifiable, right? And so it's holding myself to a really high level of accountability by by understanding how commercialization works, by understanding the business world a bit in a really deep way, by understanding value creation. Um, it 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 forces you to think along that lines, even when you come back into academia, right? And that's what drives a lot of my work here is, are we creating value? If not, if there's things that we need to change, let's change it so we create value, right? And so in my role as associate director of innovation at the school, that's the lens that I use to both inform the decisions I make, but also to communicate to other people why this sort of work right now is important.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and wisdom.
Thanks, Epi.
You know, I will tease you a bit, Ken, and say that the way you describe about adding value. I would say your cookie cutter prof researcher has a similar framework. However, the value is mostly intangible. It is, well, I'm adding value to knowledge of body, to the humanities body of knowledge by putting it through a peer-reviewed paper, and that's is seen as a value in itself. I guess so the framing of what value is it, and what's the short-term, long-term expectation. I think most faculty are seeing the short-term value is it's out in the world, and I have it on my CV that helps me get to the next rank, get the next grant, the next student, whatever, and the next publication. So it's like a self-propelling type of value, mostly intrinsic, and extrinsic is mostly abstract. And long term is, and I think a lot of profs would probably, admit that, well, maybe one day somebody will make use of it and something good will happen. Like, quantum theory led to the, nuclear energy and so on and so forth. So I think it's very, the intentionality is very different in the scale. Before we run out of time, I do want to give, I think there was another hand on, and I
I think
forgot
it was
if it was
Ronald.
Ronald, I think, was waiting for a question. I don't know if you want to
Go
chime
ahead,
in with
Ronald.
your question.
Thank you very much, Ken, for sharing those, good stories. I Yeah, part of my question has been answered from your response to Sefer. Uh, One other thing that I wanted you to, to say something about is how do you overcome the fear that people will take away your idea? Like, how do you learn how to trust people? Like, I have this wonderful solution to such and such a problem. Whom do I share it with? What if they steal it? What if So how do you overcome that fear?
Yeah, great question. And I know Alana and I, we've talked about this in the past, but honestly, I think it's called the spotlight effect, where, we think that we're the center of everybody's story, right? It's a bias, right? I think it's called the spotlight effect. But the reality is that we really aren't, right? And most people have very busy lives, and the fraction of time that other people's thoughts are occupied by you is probably a lot less than you think, right? Um, so I always like to flip what you just talked about kind of on its head, is that, I'm not so much worried, and I don't really have the fear of people taking away an idea of mine, because uh, the reality is probably, people don't really care, right? But if people do care, right? If I share out my idea in a conversation or test it out, right? With people, I'm gonna, hey, Alon, I got this idea here. I'm gonna pitch it to you, right? I do this all the time with colleagues. I'm like, hey, I have a quick idea. Let me get your thoughts, right? And when I do that sort of thing, when I share my ideas with people, what I do is I look at their reaction, I look at their facial expression, I look at how many questions they ask, I look at how engaged they are, and it gives me a sense of whether or not the idea could be viral or could be valuable, right? Is another word. Could be valuable, right? Because if somebody really resonates with an idea, it's like, oh, let me talk more, right? It's telling me that there's something possibly valuable about it, right? And so when my answer to you, Ronald, is that um, eh, don't look at it as disclosing your idea, although sometimes you do. Like sometimes there is IP, and sometimes, there are things that you have to be careful of, right? But if it's a high level conversation and you're onto something, right? Like you can talk at different levels of abstraction. You don't need to reveal the secret sauce, but you can just say, hey, what if I could solve this, right? And if more times than not you get like a resonance, right? You get people really excited about it, and then it occupies a part of their mind, right? Which is the greatest compliment anybody can give, is that, you occupy their attention, right? And if they come back to you the next day, like, hey, actually, I've been thinking more about it. You're like, oh, wow, the thing that I talked about took up even more cognitive load than the time that we spent together, right? Then you'd be like, okay, there might be something here. And that's when you start kind of going down the customer discovery process, and learning more about more people like that who might think about your solution all the time, right? And then you start like starting to research it and understand it and aggregate it, and you start to develop like a market for what you have, right? And so uh, my advice to you, Ronald, is that you must share your idea, because it is only in the sharing that you actually are able to truly define your market. Because if you don't share with anybody, you'll try to define a market in your head. And one thing that I've learned, and one thing that I think every entrepreneur has learned, is that you cannot define a market in your head, because in your head is just one version of reality, but there are billions of versions of reality. And what you are trying to do is you're trying to create the space for a shared version of a new future reality. And that's you and your market, and maybe some competitors that come along the way, right? But yeah, you have to overcome that fear, because it will be detrimental to your ability to understand A, how to connect with others and communicate with them, and understand if something like pitch, right? And B, you will not have the habit, you will not have developed the habit of defining a market, which is yeah, any venture. The only way for it to be sustainable is to have a market, right? Um,
I was going to
yeah,
actually tie it to what you talked about before about risk taking, and said that I think there's an over expectation of how much an idea is worth. And people think just because I have an idea, it's worth $1 million, but that's just BS. Um, at the end of the day, entrepreneurship is about execution. The idea is worthless if you're not executing. And so people hearing your idea, it doesn't matter because most people don't, like Ken said, are busy and they don't pay attention and they're not interested in execution. And so they'll like the idea, they'll give you your time, maybe they'll remember it for 3 seconds, but the chance of people executing on your idea in exactly the same way you are is unlikely. And whatever idea you have is going to evolve the more you engage with it. And so whatever your idea they saw in day one, by day seven, the idea will be different. Because
Yeah.
if you're doing it right, you're going to evolve with it. And then it's going to be a different idea at that point anyway.
Yeah, and I'll give you a quick example. When Peter O'Brien came into my office, I don't know, 10 years ago, he had, a really crude prototype of an analyzer stapled on particle board. And, he disclosed his idea to me, and I was like, okay, cool, let's try to build this face-worn thing, right? But, and maybe there was a lot of people who had a similar idea, right? But there's not as many people who are willing to then devote the next 5 or 6 years of their life to perfect that idea. And the process of perfecting that idea, every single day as when Peter shows up and tries to introduce the next improvement, and next improvement, next improvement, next improvement, right? What he was doing was he was building a moat, right, with potential competitors, right? So it isn't about the idea itself, because ideas are cheap and they can come to anybody at any time. And they're even cheaper with AI, right? Because you can get as many ideas as you want, right? Ideas, like infinite. There's an infinite number of ideas now that we can pursue. What differentiates people will be your commitment, your execution, your ability to build teams, high-performing teams, your ability to pitch, your ability to convince others, and then, yeah, the most important one is consistency over many, 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 many years, right? Like the companies I talked about, none of them were created in a year, 2 years, 3 years. These are decade-long ventures, right? A decade of your life. Okay, my kids are 12 and 13. Okay, I like think all that effort I put into raising my kids, imagine channeling that into something like a venture, right? So it truly is a marathon, and yeah, being able to share your idea along the way actually sometimes lightens your burden, and finding people that believe in you, like, so share away. No harm in sharing, um, but for yourself, if you're serious about it, then execute, show up every day.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's a common myth. We hear it all the time. And yeah, it never hurts to say it out loud and tell people that it's okay to share. Anyone else? We might have 5 more minutes for a quick question, and Ken, you're on the spot for keeping us under 5 minutes for an answer.
Okay, got it.
I can.
And
I'll
I've got
probably have a short one, so I'll take those 5 minutes. First of all, thank you. It's the first time for me to know about your story, and it's very fascinating. So thank you for sharing. You already touched this about the risk management. So my question for you is, do you have a suggestion for the balance between research and industry? So how can a researcher manage the risk to go on the other side, and or vice versa, and how much your being tenure influenced that managing of the risk for your
Great question. Great question. I like getting into the nitty-gritty of, like, yeah, was it a fluke that I started going into, entrepreneurship after tenure? It was not a fluke. It was a strategic decision that I made. The moment that I received the perceived job security of tenure, I knew at that point I wanted to carve out my own path, have my own journey, and then I started, taking more risks, right? Or doing things that were maybe a little unconventional, right? Um, at the same time, though, I do have responsibilities, right? And so I have responsibilities to lead a research program. I have responsibilities to teach. I have responsibilities to be a good colleague. So you do accurately point out that managing those two demands can be extremely challenging. That's why I don't encourage faculty members to start companies on their own. And I've had faculty approach me, colleagues approach me about, hey, I should start this. I'm like, make sure you find a partner, right? You'll notice that in all my stories, there was always somebody else I was working with, somebody else that I was mentoring, somebody else that I was co-founding with, right? And that was also by design. I know that I have finite time. The most finite resource I have is time, especially with kids and all that stuff, right? And so I knew that the only way that I could have a reasonable shot, even when I was on sabbatical, right? Even when I had the time temporarily, but I knew that it would disappear, right? So a key part of my strategy was working with students, working with, and sometimes undergrad, sometimes grad, sometimes it's alum, right? Alumni, but making sure that you are working with a partner as a faculty member, as a person who does have other responsibilities. It's incredibly important that, and I think the model of a tenured faculty with a student starting company is a good model. I'll tell you why. First of all, for the faculty founder, you don't have to pay them, right? They already have a salary, okay? Like they don't need to draw a salary from the company. That's the biggest expense in the startup is salary, right? Instead, the resources can be directed towards, the student entrepreneur. And also now there's increasingly more funding mechanisms for student entrepreneurs. I know, Alon, you have a student entrepreneur that you're working with, right? I'm starting to see more funding mechanisms so that student entrepreneurs who, let's say, co-found ventures with faculty can get paid those first few years. So important. Like, it's building a company shouldn't cost you everything. It shouldn't cost you a good lifestyle, right? It shouldn't cost you broken relationships, right? I don't believe in that, right? And so I think increasingly there's mechanisms in place so that those first couple years, those first critical years when money is tight and you don't have your market defined yet, uh, you might not have a product that's ready. You don't have an MVP. You don't have a minimum viable product, right? If there's some resources that can help support that student entrepreneur, and if they have a mentor, a faculty mentor who's looking long term, who's keeping their eyes on like the North Star, um, that is a really powerful combination. And so far, I'm 3 for 3, right? People always say startups fail at 90%, only 10%. I would argue that, 90% fail because their conditions weren't weren't optimal, or the conditions weren't right for them, right? And so in terms of creating conditions that are conducive to startup foundation and startup success, yeah, those first early years are really important. And don't try to do it yourself, right? Like don't be a faculty member and try to start a company at the same time. You'll fail at both, right? For sure.
I,
But yeah.
I'm just gonna
Thank you.
I'm gonna have to mention and put a plug here and say that this is this is a full circle back to the origin story of Silicon Valley, because Hewlett and Packard, who were, quote unquote, the one of the part of the story of how Silicon Valley came about. One of them was a postdoc, the other one was a grad student, and both of them were doing electrical engineering, and I think was at Stanford. Um, and I don't even remember if they were in the same lab or not, but that's how they were able to get their first prototypes. That until they got the breakthrough and they got that big opportunity with Disney, when Disney became going from silent picture to talking pictures. Sorry, no, they were already doing talking pictures, but they bumped up their quality of audio recording with their new invention, and that's what made Hewlett Packard the first breakthrough. So I think everything you said has been true and is still true from the origin of what we take for granted as the Silicon Valley story.
Yeah, and I think just for all my academic colleagues in this conversation, I think incubating in a university is like a great place to incubate startups, right? You have access to experts in a diverse range of fields. You have access to labs. You can do research. You can do further research. You can lower the technology risk, right? And then ideally, if you incubate in an academic setting, you do have like an entrepreneurial partner or somebody that you're working with that can lower the market risk, right? And the market risk isn't just the presence or absence of a market. It's also the capacity of your team to engage with that market,
Yeah.
right? Because you might have a great market, but if you're really terrible at conveying the story, guess what? You're not going to be able to gather the resources you need to be able to address that market, right? So build teams, learn to uh, appreciate the diversity of skills that are needed to succeed in venture creation. Venture creation is the hardest thing you'll ever do, eh, bar none. It is the hardest thing I've ever done. Everything else pales in comparison to it. So don't underestimate the enormity of the task. But then if you're prepared and you think it through and there's people like Alon, like myself, who are available in the academic community to help give you advice.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're happy to do that because at the end of the day, I think Alon, you and I are both aligned in that we do want to build the innovation capacity of the Okanagan of the valley in general, and we're going to need all of us, right? It's no one person can lift the innovation ecosystem. It takes all of us. It takes all of us to start, building these communities and networks and upskilling and building capacity. And venues like this are really good for that.
And so that's a great plug for me to say, first of all, that yesterday, which was December 1st, 2025, was the official launch of the UBC VMS program, the Venture Mentoring Service program that runs out of our VP Research Innovation office. And so anybody interested in mentoring or being mentored with idea or exploring what that looks like, send me an email. Happy to connect you and give you some more insight. And I will also say that this was the last Germinator in a conversation for 2025. And the next one in 2026 going to start on January 13th, 2026 with Chris Doherty. He worked with Sealman Breweries last year. He had a capstone project with Ken and I in our course, and now he's going in a different career trajectory on sustainability and strategically coaching people on the energy transition. So I'm super excited to hear how he transitioned from working as an engineer in a company going through renewable energy transition into a very purposeful career choice of now coaching and going through that coaching training and helping other people do the same thing that he was able to accomplish with Sealman Breweries. So feel free to join me back on January 13th with my conversation with Chris Doherty. And with that, Ken, it's always a pleasure. An hour is never enough. Even 2 hours would not be enough to have these conversations. So thank you very much for your time. And thank you everyone for joining us for these Germinator conversation for today. Happy holidays, happy new year to come. May we all have a good year in 2026 and beyond. And feel free to reach out by email to me and register for future Germinator sessions. And be well.
Thank you, Alon.